The day she took everything was the day he discovered what could never be taken away. On a cold Thursday afternoon in Cedar Ridge, Ohio, Caleb Donovan stood in a nearly empty driveway holding the hand of his 9-year-old daughter. The sky was gray. The wind carried the scent of rain and distant pine, and everything he had spent 15 years building was gone. The house behind him no longer belonged to him. The SUV in the driveway no longer belonged to him. Even the furniture he had paid for over countless overtime shifts was scheduled to be removed before sunset. His ex-wife, Vanessa, stood on the front porch reviewing paperwork while movers carried boxes through the front door. She never raised her voice. She never needed to. The documents in her hand had already said everything. Caleb watched quietly, not because he agreed with what had happened, not because it didn't hurt, but because standing beside him was Sophie, and she was watching every move he made. Children learn strength long before they understand words. Sophie squeezed his hand. "Daddy," she asked softly, "are we really leaving?" Caleb looked down at her. Her blonde hair danced in the breeze. Her backpack looked too large for her small shoulders. And for a moment, his heart felt heavier than anything the movers were carrying. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said gently. "We're leaving." Sophie glanced toward the house. The swing Caleb had built for her still hung from the old maple tree in the backyard. The basketball hoop they had installed together still stood near the garage. Memories lived in every corner of that property, but none of it belonged to them anymore. A moving truck door slammed shut. The sound echoed through the neighborhood. Vanessa walked toward them without a smile. "The locksmith will be here at 5, she said. "Make sure you're gone by then." Caleb nodded once. No argument. No bitterness. Just quiet acceptance. Vanessa frowned slightly, almost disappointed that he refused to fight. Then she turned and walked back toward the house. Sophie stared after her. "Is Mom mad at us?" she whispered. Caleb knelt beside his daughter. "No, sweetheart," he said carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups make choices because they think it's the best thing for them." Sophie lowered her eyes. "What about us?" The question landed harder than any court ruling. Caleb forced a smile. "We're going to be okay." He hoped it was true, because at that moment, his checking account held just over $200. $200. That was what remained after legal fees, debts, and months of uncertainty. $200 in a pickup toolbox that had seen better days. The sun disappeared behind thick clouds as Caleb loaded the final duffel bag into the back of his aging truck. The engine struggled when he turned the key. Sophie climbed into the passenger seat without complaining. She had always been brave that way. As they pulled away, Caleb looked once in the rearview mirror. Vanessa stood on the porch watching the truck disappear down the road. Neither of them waved. 20 minutes later, they crossed the edge of town. The streets grew quieter, the buildings older, the future less certain. Sophie sat silently, clutching a stuffed rabbit she had owned since kindergarten. Finally she spoke. "Daddy." "Yeah." "Where are we going to live now?" Caleb didn't answer immediately. The truth was he didn't know. Hotels cost money. Apartments required deposits. Friends had their own families and problems. Every possibility seemed to disappear the moment he reached for it. Then something caught his eye. Just beyond an abandoned gas station stood an old garage. Weathered wood. Rusted metal roof. Broken sign hanging sideways above the entrance. Most people would have seen a building that was falling apart. Caleb saw shelter. He saw possibility. He saw one last chance. He slowed the truck and pulled onto the shoulder. Sophie looked through the windshield. "What's that?" she asked. Caleb stared at the garage for several seconds. The wind rattled the loose sign. The building looked forgotten by the world. Yet something about it felt familiar, like a second chance waiting quietly in the shadows. A slow smile appeared on his face for the first time all day. He pointed toward the old structure. "Maybe," he said softly, "our future starts right there." The old garage belonged to a man named Grant Mercer, a retired mechanic who had spent 40 years repairing farm equipment before finally locking the doors and walking away. When Caleb stepped inside the following morning, the building smelled of dust, motor oil, and forgotten dreams. Sunlight slipped through cracks in the wooden walls. Rain stains marked the ceiling. A family of sparrows had built a nest above an old workbench. Most people would have called the place worthless. Caleb saw something different. He saw shelter. He saw possibility. Most importantly, he saw a place where his daughter could feel safe. Grant stood near the entrance holding a ring of keys. He was in his late 60s with weathered hands and the calm eyes of someone who had spent his life solving problems instead of talking about them. "You really want this place?" Grant asked. Caleb nodded. "It is all I can afford." Grant looked around the garage and chuckled softly. "Truth is, nobody else wants it." He glanced toward Sophie, who was carefully sweeping dust into a pile with a worn broom she had found in the corner. "How much money you got?" Caleb hesitated. Then he told the truth. $200. Grant stared at him for several seconds. The silence stretched across the room. Finally, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a key, and placed it in Caleb's hand. "Pay me $200 for 6 months, he said. Caleb blinked. 6 months. Grant nodded. "You and that little girl need a chance more than I need rent." For the first time in weeks, Caleb felt something unfamiliar. Hope. The first night inside the garage was not easy. They laid old blankets on folding cots Grant found in a storage room. The wind slipped through gaps in the walls. The building groaned every time the temperature dropped. Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor, doing homework beneath a battery-powered lantern. Her desk was an upside-down paint bucket covered with a piece of plywood. Caleb watched her quietly. Most children would have complained. Sophie never did. She simply opened her notebook and got to work. "What are you looking at?" she asked with a smile. Caleb laughed softly. "The strongest person I know." Sophie rolled her eyes dramatically. "I am 9, Daddy." "Exactly," he replied. The days settled into a simple rhythm. Caleb woke before sunrise. Sophie prepared for school. He drove her into town each morning before returning to the garage. During the day, he cleaned. He repaired leaking pipes. He patched sections of the roof with scrap metal. He reorganized old tools left behind by Grant. Every dollar mattered. Every screw mattered. Every hour mattered. At night, they shared sandwiches, canned soup, and conversations about school, books, and dreams. Sometimes Sophie would draw pictures of what the garage might become one day. One drawing showed flowers outside the entrance. Another showed a giant company logo hanging above the roof. Caleb pinned every picture on the wall. They reminded him why he could not quit. Weeks passed. Word slowly spread around Cedar Ridge. People heard about the divorced father living in an abandoned garage with his daughter. Some felt sympathy. Others shook their heads. A few quietly predicted failure. "He will be gone before winter," one man said at a local diner. "Nobody builds a future from a place like that," another replied. Caleb never heard most of the comments. Even if he had, he would not have answered. He was too busy working. One rainy afternoon, as water drummed against the metal roof, a farmer named Hank Reynolds pulled an aging hay baler into the lot. The machine had been sitting broken on his property for nearly 3 years. Several repair shops had already refused the job. Hank stepped out of his truck and looked around the garage skeptically. "You the guy fixing equipment here?" Caleb nodded. Hank frowned. "Think you can make this thing run?" Caleb walked around the machine slowly. He studied the gears. He examined the damaged housing. Then he crouched beside the engine compartment and smiled faintly. It was the first real smile Hank had seen all day. "Yes," Caleb said calmly. "I think I can." As thunder rolled across the Ohio countryside, neither man realized that old machine was about to become the beginning of everything. The rain continued through most of the night, tapping softly against the metal roof while Caleb worked beneath a hanging shop light. The old hay baler sat in the center of the garage, surrounded by scattered tools, worn manuals, and pages of handwritten notes. Most mechanics had looked at the machine and seen a problem that was not worth solving. Caleb saw something else. He saw a puzzle. And long before life had become complicated, solving puzzles had been what he did best. Sophie was already asleep on her cot when Caleb removed the final housing panel. The garage had fallen silent except for the ticking of rainwater dripping from the gutters outside. He studied every component carefully, every worn bearing, every damaged gear, every hidden flaw. Hours passed unnoticed. Near midnight, he finally leaned back and smiled. The problem was not where everyone thought it was. It never had been. At sunrise, Hank Reynolds returned expecting another apology and another expensive estimate. Instead, he found Caleb standing beside the machine with grease on his hands and quiet confidence in his eyes. "Give it a try," Caleb said. Hank looked skeptical. "That easy?" Caleb shrugged. "Not easy. Just fixable." Hank climbed into the operator's seat and turned the ignition. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the engine roared to life. The machine rattled. The belt spun. The gears engaged smoothly for the first time in years. Hank stared in disbelief. You have got to be kidding me. Caleb simply smiled. The farmer climbed down and walked around the equipment twice as if searching for hidden tricks. How much do I owe you? He finally asked. Caleb named a price that was almost embarrassingly reasonable. Hank shook his head. Every other place wanted 5 times that. Every other place gave up, Caleb replied. By the end of the week, 3 more customers appeared. Then 5. Then 8. Old tractors. Industrial pumps. Agricultural equipment. Machines that other repair shops considered hopeless somehow kept finding their way to the little garage outside Cedar Ridge. People arrived expecting miracles. Caleb never promised miracles. He simply listened, examined the problem, and went to work. What nobody knew was that Caleb had once lived a very different life. Years before marriage. Years before courtrooms and financial struggles. Years before sleeping inside an abandoned garage. He had been one of the youngest mechanical design engineers at a respected manufacturing firm in Columbus. Colleagues had called him a problem solver. Several patents carried his name. Executives predicted a remarkable future. But when family responsibilities grew and life demanded different priorities, Caleb quietly stepped away from that world. He never regretted choosing family. Not once. Yet the skills he had spent years developing never disappeared. They simply waited. One evening, Sophie sat beside him at the workbench while finishing her math homework. Daddy, she asked, how do you always know what is wrong with those machines? Caleb laughed softly. I do not. Sophie looked confused. But you fix them. Not because I know everything, he said. Because I keep looking until I understand. Sophie considered that answer carefully before writing it down on a sheet of notebook paper. Caleb glanced over. What are you doing? Keeping your good advice, she said. I might need it someday. Caleb smiled. Outside, autumn slowly settled across Ohio. The trees turned gold and crimson. The air carried the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. Business continued growing. The small garage was busier than it had been in decades. Customers began recommending Caleb to friends. Farmers recommended him to neighboring counties. Business owners passed along his number. The reputation spread quietly, exactly the way most lasting things do. Then one Thursday afternoon, something unusual happened. The distant sound of rotor blades echoed across the countryside. Several customers stepped outside and looked toward the sky. A sleek black helicopter descended toward an open field across the road. Dust swirled through the autumn air as the aircraft settled onto the ground. Conversation stopped. Work paused. Even Sophie looked up from her homework near the office window. A tall man wearing an expensive suit stepped out and walked directly toward the garage. His polished shoes seemed strangely out of place among the gravel and mud. The entire building watched in silence as he approached Caleb. The stranger extended his hand. Are you Caleb Donovan? Caleb nodded. I am. The man smiled. My name is Richard Calloway. I own Calloway Agricultural Systems. Caleb recognized the company instantly. It was one of the largest agricultural equipment manufacturers in the Midwest. Richard glanced around the crowded garage. I have heard some very interesting things about you. Then he pointed toward a massive transport truck parked near the helicopter. And I have a machine that nobody has been able to fix. Richard Calloway's transport truck carried a harvesting system worth more than most homes in Cedar Ridge. The machine had been sidelined for nearly 8 months. Engineers had examined it. Specialists had reviewed it. Expensive consultants had offered reports filled with technical language and very little hope. Yet there it sat in front of Caleb's garage, towering over the gravel lot like a challenge waiting to be accepted. Richard folded his arms. 3 companies have tried to solve this problem, he said. None of them could. Caleb walked slowly around the machine. He listened more than he spoke. He studied the housing panels, checked the control systems, and examined maintenance records. Around him, customers watched quietly. Sophie stood near the doorway holding a notebook against her chest. She had seen that look on her father's face before. It was the look he wore when a solution was somewhere nearby, even if nobody else could see it yet. How long do you need? Richard asked. Caleb glanced toward the machine one more time. A few days. Richard raised an eyebrow. That is all. Caleb nodded. That is all. News of the visit spread quickly. By the next morning, people across town were talking about the little garage and the giant corporation that had shown up unexpectedly. Not everyone was impressed. Some business owners rolled their eyes. Others laughed openly. At a local diner, Several men sat around a table near the window discussing the situation. A guy living in a garage thinks he can solve problems that corporate engineers cannot, one man said. Another chuckled. Maybe he should fix tractors and leave the serious work to professionals. The laughter spread around the table. Unfortunately, Sophie heard every word. She had stopped by the diner after school to pick up sandwiches for dinner. The comments followed her all the way back to the garage. She tried not to show it. She tried to smile. But Caleb noticed immediately. Something happened today, he said gently. Sophie looked down. Nothing. Caleb waited. He never rushed her. Finally, she sighed. People were making fun of you. The garage became quiet. Outside, autumn leaves drifted across the parking lot. Caleb set down the wrench in his hand and sat beside her. And what exactly were they saying? Sophie hesitated before repeating the comments. Each word seemed to hurt her more than it hurt him. When she finished, she stared at the floor. They think we are going to fail. Caleb smiled softly. A lot of people thought that when airplanes were invented too. Sophie looked up. Really? A lot of people thought impossible things were impossible right up until they happened. Sophie considered that for a moment. Does it bother you? Caleb glanced around the garage. The patched roof. The old tools. The drawings Sophie had taped to the wall. The folding cots hidden behind a curtain. Then he shook his head. No. Why not? Because opinions do not build anything. Work does. The answer stayed with Sophie long after the conversation ended. Over the next several days, Caleb focused entirely on Richard's machine. He skipped breaks. He worked before sunrise and long after sunset. Yet he never appeared rushed. There was a calm discipline in everything he did. He took notes. He sketched diagrams. He tested possibilities. Slowly, the mystery began to reveal itself. Late on the fourth evening, Caleb finally found the source of the failure. It was not a major component. It was not an expensive system. It was a design flaw hidden deep within a sequence most technicians never examined. He stared at the discovery and quietly smiled. The solution was elegant, simple, effective. The following afternoon, Richard returned by helicopter. Employees from his company arrived as well. Several local business owners showed up out of curiosity. Even some of the people who had laughed earlier in the week stood near the back of the crowd. Caleb explained the issue calmly. Then he demonstrated the repair. The machine started smoothly. Every system functioned exactly as intended. Silence settled over the lot. Richard looked stunned. His engineers exchanged confused glances. One of them reviewed the data twice before shaking his head in disbelief. Finally, Richard extended his hand. Mr. Donovan, he said, I came here looking for a mechanic. Caleb shook his hand. And Richard smiled. I think I found something much more valuable than that. Then he reached into his jacket and handed Caleb a business card. There is someone you need to meet. The business card remained on Caleb's workbench for 3 days before he finally called the number. The name printed beneath it was Victor Hale. Even Sophie recognized it. Victor was one of the most respected investors in the Midwest, a man known for backing companies that changed industries. Caleb was not interested in fame. He was not interested in headlines. But he was interested in building a future that no longer depended on luck. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. Victor's assistant scheduled a meeting in Columbus 2 weeks later. It should have been exciting. Instead, Caleb felt the weight of reality settling over him. The meeting required travel, proper presentation materials, and enough financial stability to leave the garage unattended for several days. Their business was growing, but every dollar was still carefully counted. Every purchase was a decision. Every expense mattered. One evening after closing, Caleb sat at the workbench reviewing numbers while rain tapped gently against the roof. The garage lights cast long shadows across the floor. Sophie sat nearby drawing in her sketchbook. Are we going to meet the investor? She asked. Caleb smiled. I hope so. You do not sound very hopeful. Caleb laughed softly. Sometimes opportunities arrive before you are ready for them. Sophie thought about that for a moment. Maybe that means you are supposed to become ready. Caleb looked at her and shook his head. You are getting too wise for 9 years old. The following week brought unexpected challenges. A supplier demanded payment. Equipment needed maintenance. The old truck required repairs. Every new success seemed to arrive holding hands with a new problem. Caleb never complained, but Sophie noticed the worry in his eyes. She noticed the longer hours. She noticed the way he studied invoices late into the night after he thought she was asleep. Quietly, she made a decision of her own. On Saturday morning, while Caleb was helping a customer, Sophie carried a small cardboard box into town. Inside were her most treasured possessions: collectible figurines, birthday gifts, toys she had carefully protected for years. The woman running the local consignment shop looked surprised. "Are you sure about this?" she asked gently. Sophie nodded. "I want to help my dad." The woman offered a fair price. Sophie accepted without hesitation. By afternoon, she returned to the garage carrying an envelope. She slipped it into Caleb's toolbox and said nothing. That evening, Caleb discovered it. At first, he thought someone had accidentally left money behind. Then he found a folded note written in careful handwriting. "Daddy, this is for the meeting. You always help everybody else. Maybe now I can help you. Love, Sophie." Caleb read the note twice. Then a third time. The garage suddenly felt very quiet. He walked outside and found Sophie sitting on the old wooden steps watching the sunset. Orange lights stretched across the Ohio fields. The wind moved gently through the trees. Caleb sat beside her without speaking. Finally he asked, "What did you sell?" Sophie stared toward the horizon. "Just toys." Caleb's voice softened. "The ones you loved?" She nodded. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Caleb wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "You should never have to give away things you love because of money." Sophie leaned against him. "I wanted to help." Caleb looked down at the note still folded in his hand. His eyes glistened with emotion. "And you did." The sun disappeared below the fields. Evening settled over the countryside. Caleb took a slow breath and made a promise he would never forget. "Listen to me, Sophie. One day you will have opportunities because of who you are, not because of what you sacrifice. I promise you that." Sophie smiled. "I believe you." 3 days later, as dawn broke over Cedar Ridge and the garage prepared for another busy morning, Caleb's phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. He answered calmly. A confident voice spoke on the other end. "Mr. Donovan, this is Victor Hale. I reviewed everything Richard Calloway sent me." Caleb straightened slightly. "And?" There was a brief pause. Then Victor laughed. "I think we should meet immediately." The meeting took place on a crisp Monday morning in downtown Columbus. Glass towers reflected the pale winter sunlight, while streams of professionals hurried along crowded sidewalks, carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Caleb parked his aging truck 3 blocks away because it was the only place he could find free parking. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, he glanced down at his work boots and worn jacket. Around him, nearly everyone looked polished and expensive. For a brief moment, he felt out of place. Then he remembered the folded notes Sophie had written. The memory steadied him. Inside the Hale Capitol building, marble floors gleamed beneath towering ceilings. A receptionist escorted Caleb to the 32nd floor. The conference room overlooked the city skyline. Long glass walls surrounded a polished oak table. Several executives were already seated when he entered. Tailored suits, designer watches, perfectly prepared presentations. One man looked up from his tablet and frowned slightly. Another glanced at Caleb's clothes before returning to his notes. No one said anything rude. They did not have to. Sometimes judgment arrived in silence. Caleb took a seat and waited. 15 minutes later, Victor Hale entered. He was older than Caleb expected, with silver hair and calm eyes that seemed to notice everything. He greeted everyone quickly before sitting at the head of the table. "Mr. Donovan," Victor said warmly. "Thank you for coming." Caleb nodded. "Thank you for inviting me." The meeting began. One executive presented market forecasts. Another discussed manufacturing trends. Charts appeared on screens. Numbers filled the room. Caleb listened carefully. Then Victor turned toward him. "Tell us your idea." Several heads lifted. A few expressions remained skeptical. Caleb stood and walked toward the display screen. He carried no expensive presentation materials. No marketing package. No professional slides. Only a notebook filled with sketches and years of experience. For a moment the room seemed uncertain. Then Caleb began speaking. He explained how agricultural equipment failures created enormous waste. He described design inefficiencies hidden inside systems manufacturers had accepted for decades. He showed sketches of modular components that could reduce repair costs dramatically while increasing reliability. The room grew quieter. Questions followed. Caleb answered each one calmly. Another question came. Then another. Minutes turned into an hour. The skepticism slowly disappeared. Executives who had barely acknowledged him earlier now leaned forward taking notes. One engineer interrupted twice simply to ask for clarification because he did not want to miss a detail. Victor remained silent throughout most of the discussion, studying Caleb carefully. Finally, one executive shook his head and laughed softly. How did nobody think of this before? Caleb smiled. Maybe they were looking at the wrong problem. The room fell silent again. Not uncomfortable silence. Respectful silence. The kind that appears when people realize they are listening to someone extraordinary. 2 hours later, the meeting ended. Most participants lingered behind discussing possibilities. Caleb gathered his notebook and prepared to leave. He expected more meetings, more discussions, more waiting. Instead, Victor approached him directly. Walk with me, he said. They crossed a quiet hallway overlooking the city. Snowflakes drifted beyond the glass windows. Far below, traffic moved through the streets like rivers of light. Victor stopped beside the window. Do you know what I invest in? He asked. Caleb shook his head. Good ideas? Victor smiled. No, I invest in people. He turned toward Caleb. Good ideas change markets. Great people change industries. Caleb remained quiet. Victor reached into his jacket and removed a folder. Inside was a proposal. The numbers nearly made Caleb stop breathing. It was more money than he had earned in years. More money than he had ever imagined managing. Funding, resources, manufacturing support. Everything necessary to transform a small garage operation into a real company. Caleb stared at the documents. You are serious? Victor laughed. Completely. Caleb looked down at the papers again. His thoughts immediately went to Sophie, to the cold nights in the garage, to the paint bucket desk, to the toys she had sold without hesitation because she believed in him. Victor extended a pen. What do you say? Caleb accepted it slowly. Then, with steady hands and a grateful heart, he signed the agreement. As the final signature dried on the page, Victor smiled. Congratulations, Caleb. Outside the window, snow continued falling over Columbus. Somewhere 2 hours away, a little girl was finishing her school day, completely unaware that the future she had believed in was finally beginning to arrive. 3 years passed faster than anyone expected. Seasons came and went across the Ohio countryside. The old garage that once leaked rainwater during storms still stood beside the road, but now it was surrounded by something remarkable. A modern manufacturing facility stretched across several acres of land. Delivery trucks arrived daily. Engineers filled bright offices. Skilled technicians worked on equipment shipped from across the country. What had begun with $200 and a borrowed chance had become Donovan Industrial Systems. Yet for all the growth, some things never changed. Every morning, Caleb still arrived before sunrise. He still walked the factory floor. He still greeted employees by name. And every afternoon, no matter how busy the schedule became, he made time for Sophie. Now 12 years old, she had grown taller, more confident, and remarkably thoughtful. One autumn afternoon, she sat in a corner office finishing homework while employees moved through the building outside. The office was larger than the entire garage had once been. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the facility. Awards lined the shelves. Industry publications carried Caleb's name. Yet sitting beside Sophie's desk was something that surprised every visitor. An old upside-down paint bucket. The same one she had used as a desk during those difficult early days. One executive had offered to replace it dozens of times. Sophie always refused. Why keep that thing? A visitor once asked. Sophie smiled. Because I never want to forget where we started. Caleb overheard the conversation and quietly smiled. Success had changed many things. It had not changed her heart. Meanwhile, Donovan Industrial Systems continued expanding. Their modular equipment designs reduced repair costs nationwide. Farmers saved money. Small businesses became more efficient. Industry leaders who once ignored Caleb now requested meetings months in advance. Some of the same people who had laughed at the little garage now praised his vision publicly. Caleb never mentioned the past. He never reminded anyone what they had said. Real dignity rarely needs to keep score. One chilly November morning, Olivia Bennett arrived at company headquarters. She was a journalist known for writing thoughtful business profiles. Instead of requesting financial statements first, she asked to see the original garage. Caleb seemed surprised. That old place. Olivia nodded. Every company has numbers. I am interested in the story. They drove together to the edge of Cedar Ridge. The garage remained exactly where it had always been. Grant Mercer still owned the property, and refused every offer to sell it. Dust floated through rays of sunlight. The old workbench remained. So did the patched roof sections Caleb had repaired years earlier. Olivia walked slowly through the building taking notes. Then she noticed something hanging on the wall. Sophie's childhood drawings. Faded but carefully preserved. A flower garden. A company sign. A better future. Olivia stared at them for a long moment. You kept these? Caleb nodded. They reminded me what mattered. Olivia looked around the room again. The simplicity moved her more than any balance sheet ever could. Over the following weeks, she interviewed employees, customers, investors, and community leaders. Everywhere she went, she heard the same themes. Character, humility, persistence, quiet strength. Finally, she sat down with Victor Hale. What convinced you to invest? She asked. Victor smiled. Everybody else saw a mechanic. And you? Olivia asked. Victor leaned back in his chair. I saw a builder. Several months later, early one winter morning, Caleb arrived at headquarters and found unusual excitement spreading through the office. Employees gathered near reception. Phones buzzed constantly. Conversations filled the hallways. Sophie walked toward him holding a magazine with both hands. Her eyes were wide. Dad, she whispered. Caleb looked down. Then he froze. There on the cover was his photograph. Beneath it appeared a headline printed in bold letters across the page. The garage builder who reinvented an industry. For several seconds, Caleb said nothing. The office around him seemed to disappear. His thoughts returned to a cold night in a forgotten garage, to a little girl studying beneath a lantern, to a note hidden inside a toolbox, to every moment when quitting would have been easier. Sophie looked up at him. You made the cover. Caleb smiled gently. Then he looked at her. No, he said softly. We did. The magazine reached newsstands across the country before sunrise. By noon, it was sitting in airport bookstores, grocery checkout lines, executive offices, and living rooms from Ohio to California. Thousands of people saw the story. Most flipped through it with admiration. A few read every word. One person stared at the cover as if time itself had stopped. Vanessa Donovan had not planned on seeing it. She was standing in line at a coffee shop on the edge of Columbus when the familiar face caught her attention from a display rack near the register. At first, she thought she was mistaken. Then she stepped closer. Her coffee order faded into the background. The conversations around her disappeared. There was no mistaking it. Caleb, the same man she once believed would never recover from losing everything. The same man who had driven away with little more than a truck, a toolbox, and a daughter holding his hand. Vanessa picked up the magazine with trembling fingers. She opened to the feature article and began reading. Page after page revealed a story she had never fully understood. The abandoned garage. The nights without certainty. The growing company. The innovations transforming an entire industry. The employees whose lives had improved because one man refused to quit. Then she reached a photograph that struck her harder than any headline. It showed Caleb and Sophie standing inside the old garage. Sophie was smiling beside the paint bucket she had once used as a desk. Caleb stood beside her with one hand resting gently on her shoulder. Beneath the image was a simple caption. Success built through perseverance, family, and second chances. Vanessa stared at the words for a long time. Memories surfaced unexpectedly. The early years of marriage. Caleb working late. Caleb helping neighbors without being asked. Caleb sacrificing promotions because family came first. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped seeing those things. She had measured success by what could be counted instead of what could be built. Across Ohio, congratulations continued pouring into company headquarters. Reporters requested interviews. Industry leaders reached out. Investors called. Yet Caleb remained exactly where he preferred to be, walking the factory floor, meeting employees, checking designs, sharing lunch with Sophie whenever their schedules allowed. The attention felt temporary. The work felt permanent. Late that afternoon, his assistant entered the office carrying a message. There is someone asking to speak with you. Caleb looked up from a design review. Who? The assistant hesitated. Vanessa. For a moment, the room became very quiet. Not tense. Not angry. Simply quiet. Caleb looked through the office window toward the factory below. Machines operated steadily. Employees moved with purpose. Everything around him existed because of years of effort, sacrifice, and grace. Finally, he nodded. Schedule a time. The meeting was arranged for the following week. Meanwhile, Vanessa found herself returning to the article repeatedly. She read it in the evening. She read it again the next morning. Each time she noticed details she had missed before. Not the financial success. Not the recognition. The character. The humility. The way every person interviewed described Caleb with respect rather than fear. The way Sophie spoke about her father with complete trust. One sentence from the article stayed with her more than any other. Real success is not measured by what you keep. It is measured by what you build for others. Vanessa closed the magazine and stared out her apartment window. The winter sky stretched gray across the city. Somewhere beyond that horizon stood a garage she once would have dismissed as failure. Now it had become a symbol of something she could not stop thinking about. Not wealth. Not fame. Redemption. And for the first time in many years, she wondered whether she had truly understood the man she had left behind. The morning of the meeting arrived with a quiet snowfall drifting across Cedar Ridge. White covered the fields. The roads glistened beneath a pale winter sun. Caleb stood near the window of his office watching employees arrive for work. Below him, trucks rolled through the facility gates. Engineers carried blueprints. Technicians greeted one another with smiles. It was an ordinary day, exactly the kind he preferred. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "She is here," his assistant said. Caleb nodded. "Send her in." A few moments later, Vanessa stepped through the doorway. Time had changed both of them. Yet the biggest difference was not visible. It was in the way they carried themselves. Vanessa paused near the entrance. Caleb stood and offered a polite smile. "Thank you for coming." She looked around the office. The walls held photographs of employees, community projects, and company milestones. What she did not see were displays of luxury or ego. No oversized portraits. No symbols of status. No trophies positioned for attention. Everything felt purposeful, grounded, real. "Congratulations," she said quietly. Caleb nodded. "Thank you." For a few seconds, neither spoke. The silence was not hostile. It was simply honest. Finally, Vanessa looked down at the magazine she had brought with her. "I read the article 3 times. Caleb smiled faintly. "Olivia is a good writer." Vanessa laughed softly. Then her expression grew serious. "That is not what stayed with me." Caleb waited. She took a slow breath. "I thought I understood what success looked like. I thought I understood what mattered." Her eyes drifted toward the window overlooking the factory floor. "I was wrong." Caleb did not rush to respond. Years earlier, he might have defended himself. He might have explained his pain. He might have listed every difficult moment. But time had a way of transforming wounds into wisdom. "We all get things wrong sometimes," he said gently. Vanessa looked at him. "You are not angry." Caleb considered the question. Then he shook his head. "Anger is heavy. I carried enough weight already." The answer seemed to affect her more than any accusation could have. She lowered her eyes. "I spent years thinking you would fail." Caleb smiled. "A lot of people did. Not like I did." Again, silence filled the room. Snow drifted beyond the glass. Somewhere below, a forklift moved through the loading area. Life continued. Caleb walked to a cabinet near his desk and removed a framed photograph. Then he handed it to her. Vanessa stared at the image. It showed the old garage, the patched roof, the faded walls, and a young Sophie sitting at her paint bucket desk beneath a lantern. "You kept this?" she asked. "Of course," Caleb replied. Vanessa studied the photograph for a long moment. Her eyes became glassy. "I missed all of it." Caleb looked toward the picture. "Some of it was difficult, and some of it was beautiful," she whispered. Before Caleb could answer, another knock sounded at the door. Sophie entered carrying a stack of school papers. Now a confident young teenager, she immediately noticed Vanessa. The room grew still. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Then Sophie smiled politely. "Hi, Mom." Vanessa's eyes filled with emotion. "Hi, sweetheart." Sophie walked over and hugged her. The embrace lasted only a few seconds, but it carried years of complicated feelings. When they stepped apart, Sophie began telling Caleb about a science project. The conversation flowed naturally, easily. Caleb watched them both and felt something unexpected. Peace. Not because the past had disappeared, not because every mistake had been erased, but because life had moved forward. Eventually, Vanessa prepared to leave. At the door, she paused one final time. "Can I ask you something?" Caleb nodded. "Why did you work so hard after everything happened?" Caleb glanced toward Sophie. She was standing near the window, smiling as snowflakes drifted through the winter sky. Then he looked back at Vanessa. His voice was calm. Steady. Certain. I did not build all of this to prove anyone wrong. Vanessa listened carefully. Then why? Caleb smiled at his daughter. Because I never wanted her to believe she was powerless. No one spoke after that. Vanessa looked at Sophie. Sophie looked at her father. Beyond the glass, employees crossed the snowy campus carrying the future forward one ordinary step at a time. And in that quiet office, surrounded by everything that perseverance, dignity, and second chances had built, the silence said more than words ever could.